Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. I also serve as the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, please consider making a donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and pressing the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Audrey Truschke and Dr. Deepa Sundaram about the new groundbreaking report published by CSRR entitled Hindutva in America, A Threat to Equality and Religious Pluralism, which is available for download on our website. Audrey Truschke is a professor of history and director of Asian studies at Rutgers University, Newark. She is the author of numerous books about India published by Columbia University Press, Stanford University Press, and Princeton University Press. She just released her fourth book entitled India, 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent, which I recommend to listeners who want to learn more about the rich history and cultures of India. Professor Truschke is joined by Deepa Sundaram, who is an assistant professor at Denver University, where she teaches courses in Hindu studies, critical theory, and digital religion. Professor Sundaram is a cultural theorist whose research examines the formation of South Asian digital religious publics. She's working on a book project entitled Globalizing Darsan, Virtual Stereology, and the Making of a Hindu Brand, and writes frequently on Hindutva and its influence on both India and the United States' commitments to equality and pluralism. Our two experts today discuss CSRR's groundbreaking report, Hindutva in America, and explain the difference between the global religion of Hinduism and the right-wing ethnonationalist ideology of Hindutva. In India, Hindu nationalists advocate a strict form of ethnonationalism that reimagines the secular Indian Republic as an exclusively Hindu nation and seeks to relegate religious minorities, especially Muslims, to an inferior status. Hindu nationalism is distinct from Hinduism, notwithstanding Hindutva proponents' erroneous claims of representing all Hindus. In the United States, Hindutva proponents seek to silence the voices of Indian Americans and others who disagree with their political ideology. They promote harmful policies favorable to India's Hindu nationalist political parties, and they seek to control knowledge about South Asia's diverse, multi-religious history. Let's hear what our guests have to say about a transnational political movement that is threatening the civil rights of Muslim, Sikh, and Christian communities of South Asian origin here in the United States.
Thank you so much for having us on this podcast. It's really our pleasure to be here, if I can speak for my colleague as well. So Hindutva, it's not a word that necessarily rolls off the American tongue for everyone, all right? I know it sounds a lot like Hinduism, but it's not. My colleague will elaborate on that relationship or non-relationship, but at the outset, these are two distinct things. Hindutva literally just means Hinduness, right? So the meaning's fine in the linguistic sense, but in reality, this refers to a far-right political ideology of Hindu supremacy, right? That's sort of your most succinct basic definition. This report actually gives a couple of different definitions of Hindutva. It talks about ethnonationalism. It talks about its effect on religious minorities. And so I would direct folks to the report for more information. But we're definitely in a political realm. We're definitely talking about a supremacist ideology where one group is said to be better than all other groups. And that group, in this case, Hindus, is supposed to have more rights at the expense of other South Asian communities. I think I'll turn it over to you, Deepa, if you want to say more.
Yeah, no, I think building off of that, one thing I would note is that Hindutva is really a reference to a sort of cultural Hindu identity. And while we would argue that Hinduism and Hindutva are not unrelated, they are not the same. Hindutva ideologues promote a kind of brand of Hinduism, which profits from a revisionist history. It appeals to caste-privileged Hindus pretty much solely. It's very exclusionary. It's Islamophobic. In fact, that I would argue that's one of the tenets of this particular political ideology. And I think most importantly, it leverages the idea that Hindus need a homeland to feel safe. And this is really Hindutva, where Hinduism does not, in its sort of core principle of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, this idea of the whole world being part of the family, another idea that has actually, unfortunately, been taken over by Hindutva. It really envisions Hindus as the only true indigenous people of India, and where Hinduism has a broader and more arguably inclusive purview, Hindutva really wants to sort of narrow what Hinduism is to these ideas.
Yeah, and I would just highlight, you said it, Deepa, but just to underscore for folks, a big part of what makes Hindutva claims sort of far right and very dangerous is their kind of strong exclusionary nature, right? So to say that many Hindus are Indians, that's a perfectly fine claim. To say that Hindus are the only Indians, that's the problematic part there, at least part of it.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we don't learn about, unfortunately, in many of the public education courses about the world, but also about what's happening in the U.S. But before we get to the U.S. context, I think it's important for us to understand the origins of Hindutva as something that originated in India. And more specifically, what political changes have occurred in India since its independence that can help us understand why Hindutva has gained such a large following. And I'll ask because many Americans know who Gandhi is, and they perceive India as a country where, this remarkable world leader who represented peace and nonviolent resistance to colonialism is the kind of representative culturally. And yet Hindutva, at least the way that you've just described it, seems completely antithetical to this vision that we have of Gandhi and by extension of India and its history. And also many of us have been taught that India was a secular state in its origins. And so can you elaborate for our viewers who are not experts on this, is where did Hindutva come from and what political changes made Hindu nationalism or Hindu supremacy, as you've just described, become so prevalent in India today? And we're in 2025 as we speak.
Sure. So I'm happy to give a little bit of background there. Mahatma or Mohandas Gandhi is an excellent place to start because of the contrast, right? You are totally correct, Sahar, that Hindutva is antithetical. It's completely opposed to Gandhi's ideas and Gandhian ethics. And in fact, a Hindu nationalist assassinated Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, right? So they were so opposed, they killed him. At that point, Hindu nationalism was relatively new. It was articulated as an ideology in the 1920s. Your true historian will go back a little further to maybe the 1880s or 90s and kind of, nascent roots, but really it's the 20s, the 1920s that it gets going. And so Hindu nationalism developed as a movement in the same time and space as the Indian independence movement that was focused on British colonialism and, getting the British out of India. Hindu nationalists, however, they basically sat out the Indian independence movement, a historical point they're quite sensitive about today. And that's because for them, the British weren't the enemy. Colonialism was not the enemy. For them, Indian Muslims were the enemy, right? So they focused on the enemy within, sort of like a classic fascist sense. Many scholars do consider Hindu nationalism to be a fascist ideology. Mahatma Gandhi comes along, they kill him in 1948. And that event, the assassination of Gandhi, it posed, in my view, a very stark choice for most Indians. Because up until that point, you had some independent stuff, you had Gandhian stuff, the people are writing the Indian Constitution starting in 1947 into 48. India is going to be a secular state. But then you also have this Hindu nationalism stuff in the background, right? You can imagine, and there were people who sort of kind of did both things in different contexts. But suddenly when Gandhi's assassinated by Nathuram Godse, an RSS member, the RSS is the chief and core Hindu nationalist group, it posed a choice. Which do you want? Do you want Hindutva? India is for Hindus only. It's an ideology that embraces violence and minority hate. Or do you want Gandhian ethics, a secular republic where all Indians are welcome, of all religious backgrounds? And for the next about 30 some years, maybe 30 to 40 years, I would say, most Indians chose Gandhi, right? And so Hindu nationalism remained an extreme minority position. Honestly, most respectable Indians didn't want to touch it in the 1950s through the 70s. But human memory fades. Okay, his memory of Gandhi's assassination faded away. There were some other events in India, specifically the emergency, if that rings a bell to certain listeners, that sort of inspired Hindu nationalist groups to be more overtly political. They'd always been covertly political, but they decided, you know what, we want national political parties. We want to contest elections. We see the founding of the BJP, which is the major Hindu nationalist party today. That's founded in 1980. And it takes a while, all right, but Hindu nationalism slowly gains ground. I think it's important to note that from its beginning, but especially from the 80s onwards, Hindu nationalism is a top-down ideology in terms of its organization, right? Hindu nationalists will tell you the opposite, and this is part of their propaganda. They'll tell you that it's grassroots and it's all just, sort of individual people doing their thing. That is not true, right? We have a hierarchical organization of groups, and this is controlled from the RSS on down that sets the agenda. Right. And so Hindu nationalists seize upon a few key issues, like the destruction of the Babri Masjid, a mosque in Ayodhya. And that's an event that happened in 1992, but continues to reverberate today. And for that reason, it's mentioned in this report. I believe towards the end is where the major treatment of that occurs. And so through these various sorts of social movements, Hindu nationalism gains popularity. With the election of Narendra Modi in 2014, and that's when the BJP becomes sort of the clear dominant political party of India. And I just want to underscore, especially for younger listeners, okay, in India's population, the Indian national population, Indian citizens are overwhelmingly very young, right? It's a notable demographic fact. And so for many Indians today, it's actually hard to imagine a world where Hindu nationalism is not the mainstream. Okay, but that's actually, this is very new, all right? This has been a minority ideology for the vast majority of the last century, but things have shifted a little bit in the last 11 years, which I think is part of what makes this report timely.
Yeah, and I'll just, add to that a little bit in talking about, sort of why it's, continued to gain popularity, not only in India, but also globally. After Narendra Modi was elected, his platform really focused on this idea that India had fallen in stature in the world, right? And that much like we hear from President Trump, we hear this idea that we need to sort of build up India, make India great again, have this idea of a great and powerful India that is a player on the world stage. And this really animated not only Indians in India, but it actually animated, and you hear this quite often in the diaspora, right? That folks are really proud of how Modi has talked about India. And this allows Hindutva to proliferate beyond the borders of India. What I would call this is like a neo-colonial type of ideology. It's not something that is seen as bringing India down, but rather that it's seen as an ideology that is protecting what India has had. And so it's really been sort of launched that way, right? Like it's been this idea that Hindutva is going to decolonize. And that word specifically is used, right? Decolonize Hindus from their British roots, that they have inculcated or they have brought in this idea of British values and that we need to remove those to have a true India. And what they really mean by that is a true Hindu India, right? So I think that a part of the appeal here to the Indian diaspora in the West in particular is that, Indians have, and this really goes back, I should say, to the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s when Indians were migrating to the West, right? Like a lot of these Indians were coming here because of favorable immigration policy. And a lot of them suffered a lot from discrimination from white supremacy, anti-Asian hate. And Hindutva started its inroads at that time, I would argue. And it's really sort of, taken root after 2014. But, you already had folks that were looking for a connection to an identity that wasn't sort of defined for them by minoritization in the West, right? Like that they were victims of white supremacy. They weren't really being treated as real members of these communities. And Hindutva offered that lifeline of identity. And I think that that kind of morphed after 2014 into this notion that, India was actually finally, putting itself out there. And it made, and if you hear this quite often, at least I do in my own research, but the Indians are really proud of how Modi has talked about India. And Hindutva appeals to that in the West. So I just want to note that, what, Dr. Truschke has described is exactly right. But we do see a shift in why Hindutva appeals, I think, in the West that's slightly different than what appeals to Indians in India.
That's interesting because your analysis of the relationship between Hindutva and kind of the anti-colonial efforts that occurred in India as well as other formerly colonized countries is about, as you describe it, trying to break from that British past or British domination. But how does that relate to the anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh, and anti-Christian manifestations of Hindutva in India? Is that a separate phenomenon, or is that also connected to this kind of post-colonial or anti-colonial theme undergirding the modern version of Hindutva? So we're still talking about India, but I think it's really important for us to understand that, especially since, as we know, the way that Hindutva manifests itself in the US, at least the consequences of it, often been most harmful, right, to the Muslim South Asian community, the Sikh South Asian community, the Christian South Asian community. So how is that understood in the Indian context before it's transported over to the United States?
Well, I can say, and I'll let Dr. Truschke actually expand on this since as the historian in the room, this is really her wheelhouse. But I'll briefly say that, going back to our definitions of Hindutva and Hindu-ness, right? V.D. Savarkar, who is our sort of founder of this ideology, argued that Indians and what he sort of saw as dharmic religions, I don't know that he would use that term, but he saw Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism to an extent, Jainism, again, wasn't really even defined as a separate religion, but that these folks were indigenous to India and they were culturally Hindu. And he spent a lot of time defining, what he saw as foreign invaders into the nation, right? Like, so he saw Muslims and Christians as not indigenous and not sort of part of that world. And I think that sort of sits there, but I'll let Audrey, sort of expand on this.
Sure. So it's a great question, Sahar, and I agree with everything that Dr. Sundaram has said. I think that one way to think about what happened is towards the end of British colonialism into the post-colonial period, when the British are abandoning India and leaving, this posed a new question, which was, what does it mean to be Indian, right? And nobody had ever asked that question before in a political sense. Okay, India was not politically united when the British showed up. There were literally thousands of Indian rulers in different parts of the subcontinent. And so there was no political identity of Indian at all, right? By the time the British leave, India is not fully united. We have the event of partition, all right, and various borders that are still disputed today. But for the bulk of people on the subcontinent, we're now going to be Indian in a political sense. And so what does that look like? And some people had the answer of secular India. The unity and diversity was a big theme. But other people said, look, Hindus are the numerical majority. We know this from the British census, which was begun in 1871. We didn't know that before. And so why isn't Hindu part of that identity, right? Ironically, given the decolonization language of Hindu nationalism, it's actually like the most colonial ideology ever, right? I mean, even the idea that one's national identity would be tied to religion, that's a thoroughly European notion.
I'll say one last point about this, in terms of why it appeals in the diaspora, right? Just to underscore a point we've both made, and, Dr. Truschke just gave a great history in a very short amount of time. this idea of Hindutva as decolonization, it's immensely appealing to diaspora Hindus that have longed for economic and social power in the Western nations that they live. I mean, they have felt marginalized for a very long time, and this has felt like a time where they were actually being treated fairly. And so they've also felt like other minorities are treated better, you know what I mean? Or they've been, sort of wanting to model their own sort of position within Western nations on other minorities. Jewish members of society, for example, in the West have always been a really important ally for Hindus and really have felt they felt a lot of kinship with them because they've been seen as somebody that does have a group that does have that economic and social power. And I'll leave with one last point on this. You have our former presidential candidate here, Vivek Ramaswamy, has made the case that that Hinduism is a Judeo-Christian tradition. He's literally sort of argued this. And his argument for this has been really interesting, in part because it does build off of exactly what Dr. Truschke is talking about, that this idea of a broader tent in the majority, but that Hindus are also part of that majority. So you see this jockeying for position in the West that isn't necessarily invested in those same exclusionary principles that were in India, but sort of transferring them to continue certain exclusions in the diaspora, but then also positioning themselves within the majoritarian narrative.
That's really interesting in the U.S. context. So I just put a little plug in for my book, The Racial Muslim, where I look at the racialization of religion in the U.S. And it was a very intentional advocacy effort that was wildly successful by Jewish American communities to redefine American national identity from Christian or Protestant to Judeo-Christian, such that then Jews are inherently kind of presumed to be part of national identity. And after 9/11, there was an effort that was not successful by a subset of Muslims to try to redefine American national identity as Abrahamic, that this is an Abrahamic country. And so it's the three monotheistic faiths. So this is the first time I've heard of a similar kind of political strategy by an Indian Hindu American politician. So that's really fascinating and apparently is taken from, it has a precedent before that. But going to the US context, and many of our listeners do live in the United States, or at least in the West. Can you explain more to them about why Hindutva is relevant here in the US, and especially to South Asian communities, which are quite diverse? And why isn't this an issue that's just limited to Indian society abroad? And in others, how has it affected our society as a whole, and how has it affected South Asian societies, and why?
I'll say a few words and I'll invite Dr. Truschke, that's written a really wonderful article on this very thing. But I'll again take us back to 2000. 2000 to now, the largest group of immigrants to the United States is actually South Asians. They have grown more than any other group. And this is something that I think is often missed by our media in the US and globally. And so South Asians have been coming into not only the US, but also Canada in large numbers since 2000. And with them, they have brought their own sort of ethnic identitarian concerns. And also, of course, being a minority in many of the places that they settled, they had that sort of cognitive dissonance of both being quite often coming from caste privileged backgrounds in India. They had a sort of majoritarian mindset, and then bringing that within the US, they were minoritized racially and often as a result of their particular ethnic positionality. I think if you look at the report, you see quite a bit about this particular positioning, right? And Indians do suffer discrimination as a result of white supremacy. And so this has allowed Indians to develop a particular kind of, position that makes them feel that they don't have a lot of power in this space. And I think that Hindutva allows folks to develop a particular kind of pride, particularly in the diaspora. And I would point out that many of these Indians, and we're not just talking about Hindus here, right? These are all of Indians that have come, and South Asians that have come from these countries, have settled in nations that once colonized them. And so for them to gain economic power in that space, and then eventually, as we see really in the 2008s onward, developing interest in becoming part of the political space, within the United States. I mean, Barack Obama mobilized the most South Asians ever for his vote. And now in the last election, we saw again, many Asians in general, but particularly South Asians vote. And those numbers are only going up, particularly in states that we would consider swing states like Arizona, North Carolina, Virginia. So they are developing both economic and political power. And at the same time, we are watching India becoming a bigger global player, both geopolitically as well as economically. They're leading on things like climate change. And all of that, I think, leads to how Hindutva has become sanitized for a lot of South Asian communities. It is not seen the way that we have described it here today by many Indians, South Asians, including many Muslims, even in the United States. They see this as a pride for India. And they also see it, although I don't know that that's true as much as it was before, from 2016 to 2024, we're seeing this collapse. But in 2016, it was still seen as something separate from American politics. So I think that's really important because, if you look at numbers, South Asians are one of the wealthiest Asian minorities in this country, and they have largely and reliably, much like Jewish Americans, voted for Democrats. That has been slightly eroded, but even in this last election, I can tell you that their numbers only dropped off about 4% from Biden's election in 2020, where the largest drop in Asian populations was actually among Chinese Americans. That's 26%. So even then, even with some folks feeling conflicted, you still see this. And then one last point I'll make is that the South Asian population in the United States is getting younger. There's a lot of youth that are being involved in politics. These are folks that are dragging their parents quite often into politics where they wouldn't have maybe been as interested. And that group is not having the same concerns, or at least responding to the concerns of white supremacy and anti-Asian hate the way that their parents did in 2000. They are responding and thinking about oppression as intersectional. Many of them are interested in thinking about fascism as a problem, far-right populism as a problem, right? So you are starting to see in the South Asian diaspora concerns around Hindutva. However, the colonialism of the US and the West and that narrative of colonialism, even if it's, let's say, cultural, that still continues to be a concern and a question in those communities. And this is something that we'll talk about, I imagine, but is discussed in the report of an intervention that many US far-right Hindutva groups have tried to make and have tried to leverage.
Professor Truschke, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. So, I definitely agree 100%. And I think a real strength of this report is that it kind of lays bare the harms of something that many people think is innocuous, right? And it's not innocuous. And so, I think that's what I really want to hit on here is that Hindu nationalism has been part of American social life for 50 years. Okay, that history, I think, is alluded to briefly or mentioned briefly in the report. But what the report, its real meat and what it dwells on is who gets hurt in the United States, who is harmed by Hindu nationalist ideas and agendas and activities here. And it's a pretty long list, right? It talks about sort of the kind of, introducing of young people to radical ideas. That's largely within the Indian American population. It talks a fair amount about Hindu nationalist educational objectives, trying to control what is and is not taught about Hinduism, about Hindu nationalism. Even about Nazi history, right? Hindu nationalists have some bizarre ideas about the swastika and do not want people to know the origins of the Nazi swastika. That's something that impacts literally all American school children. The report goes over at a couple different points, the hate campaigns, right? And this is something that Dr. Sundaram and myself have both faced personally. So we can attest to that personally as well as in our professional capacity. It talks about the denial of civil rights. Right, Hindu nationalists tend to be pretty staunchly against protections for caste-based discrimination. They tend to be relatively pro-caste and pro-caste discrimination. And that is a civil rights issue in the United States. Also talks about lobbying, right? And the extensive lobbying that Hindu nationalists do on Capitol Hill, the influence that they hold over politicians. That is unfortunately a bipartisan issue in America. Hindu nationalists have managed to strongly influence both Democrats and Republicans. There's a lot of Americans that are harmed by this, but one group stands out, which are Muslims. Right. And I mean, that is sort of Dr. Sundaram talked a lot about the differences between Hindu nationalism in India versus in the United States. The one real strong consistency is anti-Muslim hatred, right? That is throughout all the time, right? It's the grease in the wheels, so to speak. And another thing the report talks about in that vein is some of the alliances that Hindu nationalists tend to build with other hate groups in America that are also, not so keen on Muslim communities, right? Sort of general Islamophobia groups, Zionist organizations, that sort of thing, white supremacists, Christian nationalists, so on and so forth. I think the last thing I'll just highlight very briefly in terms of kind of why Hindutva is relevant in the US is that there's some pretty sketchy stuff going on in the legal realm. All right. I don't know how strongly I want to get all like law and order society here, but, I do generally feel people should follow laws or face consequences for not doing it. And Hindu nationalist groups and individuals are arguably not following all of our laws. And thus we have, undeclared foreign influences, arguably. We have illegal financial transactions, most likely, right? That's something that's worth drawing attention to.
And just to remind our listeners, the report that our experts are opining on and analyzing is the one issued by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, entitled Hindutva in America, a Threat to Equality and Religious Pluralism. Can you tell us a little more about the primary proponents of Hindutva in America? You mentioned that frequent targets are Muslims in the US, and we also saw some transnational repression where some Sikh leaders there was an attempted assassination on one in Canada and I think someone else in the US as well. That's really caused a lot of fear among the Sikh American community, and Muslims are also worried about that. We've also seen, and the report talks about the way in which Indian National Day parades are an opportunity where you see symbols of Hindutva, such as with bulldozers and other kind of clearly symbolic messages that perhaps only Muslim Indians may understand, and an American may say, well, what's the big deal? You got a bulldozer in an Indian National Day parade. So can you give us a little bit more information about who these primary proponents are, whether they're specific organizations or people, or how can we as Americans understand where the sources of Hindutva are here and how it affects our society?
Well, I'll start talking a little bit about this. I think the report does a great job of cataloging many of the organizations that do position themselves as advocates quite often for all Hindus, that actually do espouse this far-right political ideology that is, and are very openly anti-Muslim, to underscore a point that Dr. Truschke just made. And so one of them would be the Hindu American Foundation, another, which was founded in 2003, so it's been around for a very long time. Another would be CONA, or the Coalition of Hindus of North America, which is a newer organization. It was founded in 2020. We also have older organizations that are offshoots of organizations from India. So they also have a different political bent. One thing I'll point out is that Hindutva is not a monolith in the United States or anywhere else. It's actually pretty diverse. And the report does actually point to this. So groups like the HSS, or the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, are the global arm of the RSS, or the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which really is attached to, as we noted earlier, the founding of Hindutva in India. We also have the VHPA, or the Vishwa Hindu Parishad America, which was connected to the VHP in India, which largely claimed responsibility for raising the Babri Masjid in 1992. So that's a smattering of some of these groups. One other person that I might point to is a person who founded the Infinity Foundation, Rajiv Malhotra, who describes himself as a self-described Hindutva ideologue and somebody who very much identifies on the conservative side. He's very openly a conservative ideologue in the United States. and really does make very explicit claims about how the United States so-called woke ideology is being exported to India, and really sees Hindutva, I should say, as a defense against that, where you'll have folks that on the other side of that in the Hindu American Foundation that are going to say something a little bit different. They may say, actually, we really see these frameworks for, racial harm as a way for us to, address harms of what they would call Hinduphobia, or this idea that Hindus are specifically harmed in the United States because of their religion. So we have a number of these groups that have come up in the United States, and we have new ones that are often, I'm naming like 4 or 5, over 50 organizations have signed petitions for various things. And then one other point I'd like to sort of point out is that, Dr. Truschke mentioned in the previous question that, we have all of these different groups that are harmed. One other group that we haven't mentioned yet, but is discussed in the report and I think is really important, is that we see these attacks on universities and colleges. And there is a very distinct campaign, I would argue, that seems actually fairly uniform across these groups, even if they have different angles in how they do it, of attacks on academic freedom. And they found common cause with many conservative attacks on academic freedom, while also leveraging these sort of social justice frameworks for addressing or redressing harm, right? And using those to attack academic freedom. So I think, as we see these groups having mushroomed actually in the last maybe 20, 25 years, we're also seeing them learn from American politics about how they can, use their minoritized status as well as ally themselves, as Dr. Truschke pointed out very nicely, right, with particular other ideologies in order for them to sort of achieve these goals of curricular goals, policy goals, right, all of those kinds of things. And also to be able to mobilize students, which I pointed out earlier, are largely animated by social justice issues. So to frame themselves as within that space has been very fruitful for them in convincing students that would be, for example, animated by indigenous rights and decolonization to see India's concerns or Hindutva's concerns in the US as allied with that. And that to me gets back to something I think both of us have said and is talked about in the report, that we're sort of highlighting here, is that this is the danger to me. It seems innocuous, but it's not. This is a very dangerous thing to say, for example, that we need to address Hinduphobia through legislation. And we're watching Democratic politicians that have allied themselves with the Democratic socialists like Shritha Nather, like introducing such bills in Congress, which signals to the left base that this is something that is an issue for them. I would instead argue that it's like kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing that's kind of infiltrating that space.
Yeah. Professor Truschke, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that was great. Just a couple of things to sort of add on and further flesh out. One is I would just point out to folks, Hindu nationalist groups almost never self-identify that way. So if you ask a Hindu nationalist group or a member of one, are you Hindu nationalist? They'll say, oh, no, of course not. Every once in a while, you'll get someone who says, yes, but it's a good thing. Okay, but largely they don't like the labels. We identify who is and who is not Hindu nationalist by a couple of different things. First and foremost, their ideas, right? And their agendas, what they do, what they say. Also their alliances, right? So when you have the HSS, which as Professor Sundaram pointed out, that's just the RSS overseas, like literally the SS is the same, right? So like that's pretty clear, all right? So, alliances and sort of who they're representing as well come in there. The second thing I would just say, and this is going back to your original question, Sahar, of the symbols, right? Because I get it. Like you see a bulldozer in your parade and you're like, I don't know, India's developing a lot. Like they're building a lot of stuff. Maybe that's what it is, right? I get it. The thing is, the bulldozer, this was displayed in 2022 in an Indian National Independence Day parade in Edison, New Jersey, which has had a robust Indian American population for decades. And it was displayed as an anti-Muslim hate symbol because Hindu nationalists use bulldozers to illegally, without any due process, bulldoze the homes of Muslims in India. Sometimes they're critics of the state. Sometimes they're just Muslims living next door. Like that's it. Being Muslim is enough to make them a target. There's, of course, nothing intrinsic about a bulldozer, that makes it a hate symbol, right? But we always adjudicate hate symbols by their kind of cultural context and interpretation, right? So here, if it helps listeners to have a comparison, I would ask you to consider a cross, like a Christian cross with flowers on it, which is a nice symbol you see, especially in the American South, to celebrate Easter, versus a cross that is on fire. There's nothing intrinsic about something on fire that's nefarious, right? In many Hindu ceremonies, ritual ceremonies, there's a fire burning. It's a good thing, right? It's totally fine. But a cross on fire is never a good thing. That is a white supremacist hate symbol in the American context, and all Americans, I think all Americans, know that, right? The bulldozer is somewhat similar. And part of the power of the bulldozer in the American context specifically is that many Americans don't know what it means. And so to go back to that Edison Day Parade, I don't think the report goes into this level of detail on this, but there were many New Jersey politicians there. You know, state level, couple of federal level, local level, like dozens of New Jersey politicians. They all watched the bulldozer go by, no reactions. Almost every single one of those politicians had to issue a strong apology for their presence and for not calling out a hate symbol afterwards, right? And of course, their ignorance, that's why the organizers could get away with this, right? While there was a lot of backlash in that case, there's not always such strong backlash. And in any case, the symbolism is there all the same. Like the harm is done. I mean, the message to Indian American Muslims was very strong. Like, we Hindu nationalist Americans, yeah, we can do this. We can march this down Main Street and we can scare you. And there's nothing you can do about it, except some letters later from politicians saying, yeah, I'm sorry, right? And so that sort of thing, that's very harmful to American society. And I think that's where the report's really, getting at the kind of cutting against religious pluralism in the United States, right? And the kind of higher ideals of the nation that we want everyone to live together in, relative harmony.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other point. The later parade in New York for India Day that featured a replica of the Ram temple or mandir that was built as a promise. It was a fulfillment of a promise by Modi in India. This is a direct connection, right, of a thing that's happening in India that was very much marketed and mediatized for an American audience, and not just American, but a global Hindu audience. Putting that float was a dog whistle to Indian communities that India is launching itself as a Hindu nation. And this is what Modi had hoped in 2024 when he went up for election, was hoping to change the constitution. It did not work out that way. In fact, Ayodhya voted against him in a very interesting turn of events. This is not something that may be legible or understandable to broad American communities. They might oh, look, a nice temple. That's nice that they're celebrating that, right? But Indians and Indian Muslims in particular, Indian Christians, Sikhs, all saw this for what it was, right? They saw that replica by the VHPA as an attack. And I'd point out that they then, the subsequent defenses of that, this is discussed in length in the report in connection to the bulldozer. The defenses are oh, what? We're not allowed to celebrate our culture, right? And so then it really plays on those sympathies of minoritization and marginalization of Hindu communities. They're about 1%, right? South Asians are about 1% of the United States. They're not, you know what I mean? They're not a big group. So they are legit, right, minoritized, but then sort of playing on this. And then one other point I'd make about the bulldozer is that it wasn't just a bulldozer. It had a picture, right, of Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state in India and has the largest Muslim population. That was not an accident. And I'd also point out that this wasn't just an attempt to sort of speak to a particular part of the South Asian community in the US. This was also an attempt, in my view, to sort of promote a revisionist history of Indian independence, right? It was deliberate that it was put in the Indian Independence Day parade, right? This is arguing that India is Hindutva and the modern India is Hindutva. It's not, the Gandhian ideals that we talked about earlier. So they are really trying to sort of push back on what they saw as a problematic sort of politics in India up until the Hindu nationalists were able to take over.
That's a lot to think about. And I'll just remind our listeners to read the report by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, Hindutva in America, A Threat to Equality and Religious Pluralism, which you can download at csrr.rutgers.edu. And as we kind of conclude our conversation, I think that it would be really beneficial for our listeners to know from your expert opinion as scholars of South Asia, what do you recommend can be done at the policy making level and the grassroots level to address the rising problem of Hindutva in America? And kind of relatedly, what specific initiatives are underway and how effective have they been? So it's kind of answering the question, what do we do about this? Our start is our listeners reading the report, listening to this podcast, but how do we make sure that this doesn't become another source of Islamophobia or anti-Sikh racism, or again, a threat to religious pluralism in the US, and that we discover it before it's too late to reverse it meaningfully?
So I can take that. I think I would answer it sort of two different ways. First, on the policy point, I think I would just sort of summarize the recommendations of the report. The report has 5 recommendations. As I read it, it falls into sort of 3 major categories. The first has to do with sort of applying existing American laws. One of the recommendations concerns the denial of visas to people who have been known to violently promote religious intolerance abroad. That's nothing new. It's on the American law books. Just apply that in the case of Hindu nationalists who qualify for it. And then a second recommendation concerns making sure that Hindu nationalist organizations register with FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. The Overseas Friends of BJP is registered under that. That's noted in the report, but other Hindu nationalist groups are not, and some of them probably should be. A second sort of policy area concerns transparency of kind of the financial links between Hindu nationalist groups here and Hindu nationalist groups abroad. For example, that Ram temple that Professor Sundaram was talking about, which is built on the rubble of the illegally destroyed mosque in Ayodhya, that was probably largely paid for by the diaspora, but tracking the money exactly is very difficult. The report does not specify how to further track those financial transactions, but I think that remains a goal. And then the third kind of poll around which the 5 recommendations center concerns kind of education and awareness. There's one recommendation that calls for institutes of higher education, especially, to be aware of the unusual focus, especially hyper-focus, let's say, of Hindu nationalists on American academics, both professors and students, and what that can mean, and take precautions and keep everybody safe. Another one concerns sort of that law enforcement organizations should stop partnering with Hindu nationalists. And I would really underscore that one because that is incredibly easy to achieve. We've seen instances where, a Hindu nationalist group calls up the local police department, let's do a joint event. They do a joint event. I'm guessing from the police department's perspective, this is like a few guys are gone for a few hours, no big deal. But for the Hindu nationalist group, they use those photos. They distribute them widely, internally in US-based networks and abroad in India-based networks. And that is used to intimidate religious minorities globally. Okay. And so US-based law enforcement groups should just sort of widen their gaze a little bit and stop doing that sort of thing, right? They're giving a lot of fodder to Hindu nationalist groups, and it's ultimately working against US law enforcement goals. I think the second way I would answer was on the grassroots level. I think awareness is always one of our best kind of armors. Be more aware of Hindu nationalism, including try not to fall for their propaganda, right? So the next time you see something you think it might be Hindu nationalist, you ask a question, and whoever you're asking responds, usually yelling. Okay, Hindu nationalists yell a lot. They really like to scream. But they respond very vehemently. No, you have it wrong. You're anti-Hindu. Don't fall for that. Take that as your cue to ask more questions. Maybe not to them. Maybe in a different way later. Somebody else. I don't know. Don't ignore your instincts and the red flags when you see them. The last thing I would say on the grassroots point, and this one is a bit more personal for me, is just I don't think we should cede the ground that Hindu nationalists argue over, right? And so, for me as a non-Hindu American, I have nothing to say on Hindu identity. But as a historian of South Asia, I have a lot to say on that subject, right? And I completely understand the desire of Hindu nationalists to look at Indian history now in the colonial period way further back and to see a history that they can take pride in. I have that same desire, right? I think South Asian history is awesome and amazing. The difference is I think that the real deal is pretty awesome and amazing, right? And so I refuse to cede that ground. I think South Asians should take pride in South Asian history, or Indians take pride in Indian history. I'm not super picky on the nomenclature issue. I just think you should take pride in the real thing. And so for me, given my skills and training, I spend a lot of time, really an inordinate amount of time, talking about South Asian history and telling those real stories, translating them from ancient languages, and bringing it alive to people. So whatever that looks like for you, whatever identity or identities you care about and that speak to you and that you are positioned to talk about, do it.
If I may just add one thing, that was an excellent summary of what was discussed in the report, but also about Dr. Truschke and myself in the kind of work that we do and where we really center our scholarship. I would really implore our policymakers and lawmakers to consider the resources on Hindutva in the United States, including this report and other resources that are out there when looking at political appointees. It's a very niche thing, but this is the most Hindu nationalist American administration in our lifetime. I have never witnessed this many Hindu nationalists. And they're in positions of power, particularly in law enforcement, to underscore a point that Dr. Truschke has made. And I will say that largely our politicians didn't blink an eye at that. Some of them did point some of this out, but I think it's really important that this flying under the radar we've talked about has now made it into our White House. And these are folks who have control over things like very important, adjudicating bodies that are going to be able to sort of bring those ideologies in, perhaps not visibly. And that, I think, is really dangerous. So this is where a report like this can really provide an important intervention and literacy on this in ways that will really protect, to go back to what we had talked about earlier, those that are harmed by Hindutva. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, not all Hindu nationalists are South Asians. We actually have a number of people in this country and in the world that have aligned themselves with Hindu nationalism. Some of them are white nationalists, but they have espoused Hindutva ideology, something like Tommy Robinson in the UK, or even Steve Bannon in the US. And so it's important for us to sort of keep this as an ideology, yes, largely in South Asian communities, but one that is transferable and finds common cause with, as we noted, other supremacist ideologies that have also, found ways to become part of our lawmaking bodies in this country and policymaking bodies in this country. So I just think it's really important that, that literacy is there, because we make decisions quite often in black and white terms, like of you're a minority, you're not, you're discriminated against, you're not. And Hinduism really sit in a liminal space. They sit in between that. Right? They are victims of white supremacy, victims of anti-Asian hate. South Asians are largely, but Hindutva is not that, right? This is very much a far right ideology that is trying to leverage that kind of victimization for their own political gain in the US.
Well, thank you so much. This was enlightening, and I hope it triggered our listeners' interest in learning more about Hindutva in America, specifically by reading the report by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, Hindutva in America, Threat to Equality and Religious Pluralism, available at csrr.rutgers.edu. So thank you so much, Professor Truschke and Professor Sundaram, for lending your expertise in analyzing this report.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.